grass.
"You've seen my trick. Show me yours again."
Sydney took the skull, which was no bigger than a ring. It was unbroken, unblemished, but not enough.
"I can't,"
she said, handing it back.
"There's too much missing."
"Sid," called Mitch. The stranger drew a folded bookmark from her back pocket and a pen from her curls. She scribbled something down the side and held it out.
"In case you ever need a friend."
She leaned in close.
"Girls like us got to stick together,"
she added with a wink. Mitch called Sydney's name again.
"Better go,"
said the stranger.
"Wouldn't want the big guy to worry."
She ran her fingers over Doll's muzzle.
"You look after our girl,"
she told the dog.
"See ya,"
said Sid.
"You bet."
Mitch was waiting for her across the field. "Who are you talking to?" he asked. Sydney shrugged.
"Just some girl,"
she said, realizing she hadn't asked for a name. She glanced over her shoulder and saw the stranger still leaning back against the tree, holding the little white skull up to the light. That night, Sydney put the number in her phone. The next, she sent the girl a text. "I forgot to tell you. My name is Sydney." She held her breath and waited. The reply came a few seconds later. "Nice to meet you, Sydney," it said. "I'm June." Roman numeral 14. 4 weeks ago. Holloway. Sid was helping Mitch clear the cake when she felt the phone buzz in her back pocket. She excused herself, slipped into her room, and shut the door behind her before reading the text. June. "Happy birthday, Sid. XOXO. She felt herself smile. June. "Get anything good?" Sid sent her a photo of the bomber jacket. Sid. "Doesn't fit." June. "Good thing vintage never goes out of style." Winking emoticon. Sydney turned toward the closet mirror, studying her reflection. 18. Officially an adult, even if she didn't look it. She considered the boots, the blue hair, the bomber jacket. It really was too big for her. How long before it fit? 10 years? 20? Victor thought Sydney's aging, the lack of it, had something to do with the way she died. The icy water that froze her limbs and stopped her pulse. All this time, and her vitals were still slow, her skin still cold to the touch. Everyone else was changing. Victor getting leaner and harder by the year. The lines around Mitch's eyes, Doll's muzzle edging white. Only Sydney seemed to stay the same. And Eli, she thought, a chill running through her. But he was gone, and she had to stop summoning him, stop inviting him into her head. Sid sank onto the edge of the bed. "Sid, where are you?" June. "Just got to Merritt." Sydney's pulse quickened. Sid. "Really? How long are you staying?" June. "On a job, just passing through." Sid. "I wish I could be there with you." June. "You could be." Winking emoticon. But they both knew it wasn't that simple. Sydney wouldn't leave Victor, and as far as Victor was concerned, Merritt and all of its skeletons belonged in the past. Roman numeral 15. 2 years ago. South Broughton. The dead mouse lay on Sydney's desk, curled atop a floral dish towel. A cat had obviously gotten to it. There were bits and pieces missing, leaving the rodent more than half, but less than whole. It was late summer, and Sid had the window propped up to keep the smell from gathering. Doll had his chin resting on the window frame, sniffing the air on the fire escape while she worked. More than once she'd resurrected a small animal, only to have it race away from her fingers and out into the apartment, burying itself under a sofa or behind a cupboard. More than once Mitch had been summoned to help extricate it. Victor had noticed her practicing, even encouraged it, but he had one rule: she couldn't keep any of the animals she brought back. They were to be set free. Or disposed of. Doll, of course, was the sole exception. Down the hall, a door opened, closed, and the dog's ears perked. Victor was back. Sydney held her breath and listened, hoping to glean good news from the tone of his voice or Mitch's reaction. But within seconds she could tell. Another dead end. Her chest tightened, and she turned her attention back to the dead mouse, cupping her palms over the tiny furred corpse. Her backpack sat on the bed beside the desk, the small red tin resting on top. Sydney's gaze flicked toward it, the action almost superstitious, like throwing salt over your shoulder or knocking on wood, and then she closed her eyes and reached, past the body, to the darkness, searching for the thread. With every passing second, the cold climbed her fingers, spread past her wrists and up toward her elbows. And then, at last, the thread brushing her fingers. A twitch against her palm. Sid gasped and blinked, and the mouse was whole, was alive, was scurrying out of her hands and across the desk. She lunged and caught the small rodent, setting it on the fire escape and closing the window before he could follow her back in. She turned toward the hall, excited to tell Victor and Mitch about the feat, small as it was. But halfway there, Sid slowed, stopped, held back by something in Mitch's voice. "Is it really necessary?" "It's a calculation," answered Victor coldly. There was a pause, the sound of ice shifting in a glass. "You think I enjoy killing people?" No, I don't know. I think sometimes you make the easiest choice instead of the right one. A low, derisive snort, if you're still hung up on what happened with Serena. Sidney's breath caught on the name, a name no one had uttered in almost 3 years. There could have been another way, said Mitch. There wasn't, growled Victor, and you know it, even if you want to pretend you don't. Sidney pressed her hand over her mouth. Make me the villain of that night, Mitch. Wash your hands of any blame. But don't act like Serena Clarke was merely a victim or even a casualty of circumstance. She was an enemy, a weapon, and killing her wasn't just smart or easy. It was right. Victor's steps sounded on the hardwood as he came down the hall. Sid scrambled back into her room. She went to the window and threw it open, stepping out onto the fire escape. She leaned her elbows on the metal rail, tried to pretend she was looking dreamily out at the city instead of making fists so tight her fingers ached. But Victor didn't even slow down as he passed Sidney's door. She sank to her knees when he was gone, bowing her head against the bars. A memory washed over her of that night, of Serena's voice in her ear telling her not to run, of the way Sidney's mind had gone smooth, her limbs soft under the order, of the cold parking garage and the gun against her head, of the long pause and then her sister's order to go, to find somewhere safe, somewhere which had once been someone. Victor. But Victor, some part of her had known, had to have known. Sidney felt like she was going to scream. Instead, she left, took the fire escape 2 stairs at a time, didn't even care about the way her steps rattled as she crashed down floor after floor. She hit the street and kept going. 1 block, 3 blocks, 5. Sidney didn't know where she was going, only that she couldn't turn around, couldn't look Victor in the eyes. She drew her cell from her back pocket and dialed June. They'd been texting for almost a year, exchanging small notes, anecdotes about where they were, what they were doing. But Sid had never called. The phone rang and rang and rang, but no one answered. Sidney's steps slowed, the initial wave of shock settling into something heavier. She looked around. She was on a narrow street, not an alley exactly, but not a main road either. People said cities didn't sleep, but they did get quiet and dark. Turn around, said a voice in her head, but it sounded like Victor, so Sidney kept going, which was a mistake. The thing about mistakes was that they weren't always big or obvious. Sometimes they were simple, small. The decision to keep walking, the turn left instead of right, those few extra steps in the wrong direction. Sidney was trying to call June again when she saw them. 2 men, one wearing a black leather jacket, the other with a kerchief slung around his throat. She stopped walking, caught between turning around, which would mean putting her back to the men up ahead, or continuing forward, which would mean passing within arm's reach. They hadn't noticed her at first, or at least they'd pretended not to. But now they looked at her and smiled. The men didn't look dangerous, not like in the movies Sid watched with Mitch, but she knew that meant nothing. Everyone who'd ever hurt her had looked safe. And the longer she stayed put, the more she felt the badness wafting off them like cheap cologne, something she could smell and taste.
Hey, little girl,
said one, moving toward her.
You lost?
No, said Sidney.
And I'm not a little girl.
Different time we're living in, said the second. They grow up so fast. Sid didn't know how they'd gotten so close to her, so quickly, but as she shuffled backward, turned to go, a hand caught her collar. The guy in the leather jacket wrenched her back against him, one arm wrapped around her shoulders.
"Oh, now, don't be rude."
"Get off me," she snarled. But he was squeezing too hard, and she couldn't breathe, couldn't think. She felt something hard dig into her ribs, realized it was a gun. She twisted in his grip, trying to grab it. "Careful," said the other one, closing in. "She's got spirit." Sid tried to kick out at the other guy, but he jumped back, wagging his finger. Her fingers skimmed the gun, but she couldn't quite get it. The first man's breath was hot and sour on her cheek. "Come on now, let's have some fun." Sid slammed her head back into his nose, or tried, but her head only came to his chin. Still, she hit bone, heard the crack of a tooth, and she was free, stumbling to her hands and knees as the man reeled, the gun tumbling from his waistband. Sid lunged for it, fingers closing around the grip, right before one of the men grabbed her ankle and pulled. The street bit into her elbows and scraped her shin as she twisted around and raised the gun, barrel leveled at the man's heart. "Let go," she snarled. "Oh, shit," said the man in the kerchief, but the other one sneered at her, blood spilling from his mouth. "That's an awfully big gun for such a little girl."
"Let go."
"You even know how to use it?"
"Yes."
Sidney squeezed the trigger as she said it, bracing for the recoil, the bang. But nothing happened. The man laughed, a short barking sound, and knocked the gun from her hands. It went skidding away. "Little bitch," he said, raising his boot as if she were a bug, something to crush. He brought it down hard. Or at least, he started to. But his leg seemed to lock up halfway. and then he toppled, a single horrifying sound leaking from his clenched teeth. An instant later, the second guy fell, limbs seizing, as Victor walked toward them, his collar up against the cold. Relief washed over her, tangled with shock.
What are you doing here?
The men on the ground writhed in muted agony, blood leaking from their noses and vessels breaking in their eyes. Victor knelt to retrieve the discarded gun. A little gratitude would be nice. She rose on shaky legs, the anger catching up.
You followed me.
Don't try for the moral high ground, Sidney. You snuck out.
I chose to go. I'm not a captive.
You're a child, and I promised to protect.
A promise you can't keep is just another lie,
she snapped. She was sick of everyone lying. Mitch had lied when he told her Victor was fine. Eli had lied when he said he wouldn't hurt her. Serena had lied when she said she'd never leave. And Victor had been lying every day since his return.
I don't want you to save me,
said Sidney.
I want to save myself.
Victor weighed the weapon in his hand. All right, he said, offering her the gun. The first step is to turn the safety off. Sidney took the weapon, marveled at the weight in her hands. It was heavier than she expected, lighter than she expected. Her thumb slid over the catch on the side. If you want, said Victor, turning back toward the mouth of the alley, I'll teach you how to shoot. Sidney wasn't ready for him to walk away.
Victor,
she called, gripping the gun.
Did you do it?
Victor slowed to a stop, turned. Did I do what? Sidney held his gaze.
Did you kill Serena?
Victor only sighed. The question didn't seem to take him by surprise, but he didn't answer it either. Sidney raised the gun, training it on his chest.
Did you do it?
What do you think? Sidney's grip tightened.
I need you to say it.
Victor moved toward her slowly, steadily. I warned you when we met. I wasn't a good person.
Say it,
demanded Sid. Victor came to a stop an arm's length away, halted only by the gun against his ribs. He looked down at her. Yes, I killed Serena. The words hurt, but the pain was dull, not a knife wound or a plunge into ice water, but the deep ache of a fear realized, a suspicion turned to truth.
Why? Why did you do it?
She was unstable and unquantifiable, a danger to everyone in her path. The way he talked about her, about everything, as if they were just factors in an equation. But Serena wasn't a factor, a problem to be solved.
She was my sister.
She would have killed you.
No,
whispered Sid. If I hadn't killed her, the cops would still be under her control. Eli would never have been caught. He'd still be free. Sidney shivered, the gun trembling in her grip.
Why did you burn her body?
I couldn't risk you bringing her back. Victor's hand drifted up to the gun. He wrapped his fingers loosely around the barrel, not tight enough to stop the action if she pulled the trigger, just enough to keep the weapon steady. Is this what you want? Killing me won't bring her back either. Will you feel safer if I'm dead? Think hard, Sidney. We all have to live with our choices. Sidney shuddered, and then she let go of the gun. Victor caught the weapon before it hit the ground. He ejected the clip and then knelt so they were eye to eye. Look at me, he said coldly, catching Sidney's chin in his hand. The next time you point a gun at someone, make sure you're ready to pull the trigger. He straightened, sat the weapon on a nearby crate, and walked away. Sidney wrapped her arms around her ribs and sank to her knees on the pavement. She didn't know how long she sat there, before her phone finally rang. She drew the cell from her pocket with shaking hands and answered.
Hey, kiddo,
said June, sounding breathless.
Sorry, I was finishing a job. What's up?
10 minutes later, Sidney was sitting in a diner, the kind that stayed open all night, clutching a cup of black tea. It had been June's idea. The seat across from Sid was empty, but if she kept her eyes on her tea and her ear to the cell phone, she could imagine the other girl sitting in the booth across from her, the sounds of another diner in another city, the bell of an order ready for pickup, a spoon stirring sugar in a cup, made a soft curtain of noise on the line.
You said you were working,
said Sid, making small talk.
What do you do?
A pause on the line.
Do you really want to know? Yeah. I kill people.
Sidney swallowed.
Bad people?
Sure,
most of the time. Do you like your job?
A soft sound, somewhere between an exhale and a laugh.
What would you think of me if I said yes?
Sid looked up at the empty booth.
I'd think at least you were being honest. What happened tonight?
Asked June.
Talk to me.
And Sidney did. The words just spilled out. She couldn't believe how easy it was to talk to June, how good it felt, amid so many secrets, to share some truth. She hadn't felt that ease with someone, not since Serena died. It was like taking a deep breath after being underwater. Talking to June made her feel normal. She told her about Victor and Mitch, about her sister, About the day they drowned, the way they came back, her slowly and Serena all at once. She told her about Serena's powers, and about Eli.
Is he like us?
Asked June.
No,
growled Sydney. She took a deep breath.
I mean, he's an EO, but he's not like us. He thinks we're wrong, that we shouldn't exist. So he started killing us. He killed dozens of people before Victor stopped him.
Sydney's voice sank until it was barely a whisper.
My sister. She and Eli.
But it wasn't all Serena's fault. Her sister had been lost for a really long time when Eli found her. Sydney had been lost too, but Victor had been the one to find her. It wasn't Serena's fault that Sydney got the hunter, and she got the wolf.
I know what happened to Serena,
said June. Sydney stiffened in her seat.
What?
A sigh.
In order to take someone's face,
said June,
I have to touch them. And when I do, I see things. Not everything, no room in my head for that much useless memory. Just the bits that make them who they are. The ones that matter most. Loves, hates, important moments. Mitch. I touched his arm that day in the park, right before you and I met, and I saw him standing before a fire. There was a girl's body in the flames, but all I felt was his regret.
Sydney closed her eyes, swallowed hard.
Mitch didn't kill Serena,
she said.
Victor did. Why would he do that?
Asked June. Sydney let out a shuddering breath.
My sister could control people. She had this hold on them, could make them do anything she wanted just by saying the words. She was strong, powerful, but she was like Eli. She thought people like us were lost, broken.
Maybe she was right, said June.
How can you,
started Sydney.
Hear me out,
pressed June.
Maybe we are broken, but we put ourselves back together. We survived. That's what makes us so powerful. And as for family, well, blood is always family, but family doesn't always have to be blood.
Sydney felt hollow, worn out.
What about you?
She asked.
Do you have a family?
There was a long pause.
No,
said June softly.
Not anymore. What happened to them? Did they die? No,
said June.
But I did.
A long pause.
You see, they wouldn't recognize me. But you were you first. Can't you just change back? It's complicated. What I can do,
she said slowly,
makes me invincible. But only as long as I'm someone else.
June hesitated.
I buried someone. So did my family. There wasn't a grave, but I'm still gone. And it needs to stay that way. When I came back, I decided that no one would ever hurt me again. I gave up everything, everyone, in exchange for that.
Sydney frowned.
Was it worth it?
A long silence. And then June said,
Yes.
The sound of a coffee mug shifting on a table.
But hey, like I said, not all family is blood, right? Sometimes we have to find a new one. Sometimes we get lucky, and they find us.
Sydney looked down into her tea.
I'm really glad we met. Me too.
Neither spoke for a few minutes, the ambient noise of their respective diners collapsing the distance. June hummed softly, and Sid wished she were really there, sitting across the table. Sydney closed her eyes.
Hey, June?
Yeah, Sid. Her voice cracked.
I don't know what to do. You could leave.
She'd thought about it. She was so tired of moving, of living out of a backpack, of chasing down lead after lead, only to find dead ends. Sick of watching Victor suffer, of knowing it was her fault. But that was exactly why she couldn't go. Victor had killed Serena, yes, but Sydney was killing him. Over and over. She couldn't abandon him. She wouldn't abandon Mitch. They were her family. They were all that was left. They'd taken her in, given her hope.
Sid? I can't. Well then,
said June. Sydney heard coins drop on the table, June pushing back her seat.
I suggest you go home.
Roman numeral 16. 1 year ago. Edgefield. It was too hot for Halloween. They were in a college town somewhere down south, the air still sticky, the streets crowded with groups of teenagers heading to parties, and Sydney had decided to go out. She stood at the bedroom mirror, adjusted the dark brown bob, put on the darkest lipstick she could find, traced black lines around both eyes. But the older she tried to look, the more ridiculous she felt. Sid tore the wig off and slumped back onto the bed. She took up her phone, read the last few texts from June. June. So go out. Sid. I can't. June. Says who? June. You're 17. June. You can make your own decisions. June. They can't stop you. Sid rolled to her feet and began again. She'd gone into a costume shop the day before with Mitch, found a generic anime schoolgirl getup, if looking older wouldn't work. Maybe she could pass for someone trying to look young. Sid combed her blonde hair, pulled on the pleated skirt, and adjusted the bow at her throat. She slipped the gun, these days she never went anywhere without it, into a tiny backpack, then marched out into the apartment. Victor sat at the kitchen table poring over profiles, Doll asleep at his feet. Mitch was on the couch, watching a college football game. He sat up when he saw her.
You dressed up?
Yeah,
she said, starting toward the door.
I'm going out.
Mitch crossed his arms.
Not alone, you're not.
He was already pulling the deck of cards from his back pocket. Anger whipped through Sydney at the sight of them.
This isn't a stupid game,
she said.
It's my life.
Sydney,
said Mitch, a new firmness in his voice.
Stop treating me like a child.
Then stop acting like one, said Victor, without looking up. Mitch shook his head.
What's gotten into you?
Nothing,
she snapped.
I'm just sick of being cooped up.
Let her go, said Victor. She's giving me a headache. Mitch rounded on him.
You're not helping.
She can take care of herself. His eyes met hers. Isn't that right, Sid? She bristled at the challenge in his voice. Well, he sneered. What are you waiting for? Sydney stormed out, slamming the door behind her. She made it down to the street before she stopped, folding onto the steps. What's gotten into you? She didn't know, but she knew that she couldn't stand another minute in that apartment. That cell, that imitation of a life. It wasn't just the heat, or the constant moving, or even having to watch Victor's life force wane like a candle. Sydney just wanted one night of feeling normal. Human. A car flew past, a teen hanging out the window, smiling a rictus skeleton grin. Girls laughed as they stumbled by in too short skirts and too tall heels. Across the street, a group of guys in wolf masks threw their heads back and howled. Sydney got to her feet and made her way to the corner, where a dozen flyers had been tacked to a telephone pole, advertising parties at clubs and frat houses. Monsters Ball, said one. Screamfest, promised another, the letters dripping blood. Heroes and Villains, announced a third. Underneath, in parentheses, the disclaimer, no sidekicks. Sydney pulled the last flyer from the post and started walking. She could hear the music from the street. The heavy bass poured through the open front door, where a guy in a cape was making out with a girl in a horned mask. The house beyond was filled with strobe lights, the staccato flashes paired to the music, so the whole place looked like it was moving. It was the kind of party her sister would have been at, the kind of crowd she would have wrapped around her finger. That was the thing about Serena. By the time she got her powers, she was already used to being in control. Serena didn't bend to the world. She made the world bend to her. But as Sydney climbed the steps, her resolve wavered. She hadn't been around this many people at once, not since she went to visit Serena at college. Right before everything went wrong. Sid closed her eyes, could see her sister leaning in the doorway. You're growing up. Could feel the weight of Serena's arms around her. I want you to meet Eli. The cold of the soda in her hand. You can trust him. The crack of the gun sounding in the woods.
Kawaii.
Sid looked around and saw a dark-skinned girl in gladiator sandals perched on the front porch rail, long legs swinging as she smoked.
Or is it chibi?
She went on, nodding at Sid's costume.
I can never remember.
The girl offered up the cigarette, and Sydney reached to take it. She never smoked, but she'd seen Serena do it. The trick is to hold the smoke in your mouth, like this. The tip of the cigarette had glowed red. Serena had counted on her fingers 1, 2, 3, and then exhaled a perfect plume of white. Now Sydney did the same thing. The smoke filled her mouth, hot and acrid. It tickled her nose, crept into her throat, and she quickly blew it out before she could start coughing. Her head felt cloudy, but her nerves were settling. She handed the cigarette back and stepped into the party. The house was teeming with students, dancing, shouting, moving, sprawling. Too many, too much. She felt jostled by elbows, shoulders, capes, wings, caught up in the sea of bodies, motion. Sydney stepped back, trying to get out of the waves, and collided with a man in a black domino mask. Her heart lurched. Eli. Her fingers flew toward her backpack, but it wasn't him. Of course it wasn't him. This boy was too short, too wide, his voice too high as he shuffled past her, calling out to a friend across the crowded room. Sydney was just starting to relax when someone caught her wrist. She spun around to see a tall guy in a metal helmet and skin-tight spandex. How did you get in here? He raised her arm, and his voice at the same time. Who brought their kid sister? Sydney felt her face flush hot as heads turned. I'm not a kid, she snarled, pulling free. Yeah, sure, come on, he said, pushing her toward the front door. What Sydney would have given in that moment for Victor's power instead of hers. The college boy shoved her across the threshold. Go trick-or-treat somewhere else. Sydney stood on the front porch, face burning, as the party raged behind her and more guys and girls started up the path to the house. Tears threatened to spill down her face. She fought them back,
Hey, are you okay? Asked a guy in a cape, kneeling beside her. You want to call someone? Fuck off, said Sydney, marching down the steps, her face on fire. She couldn't go home, not yet, and she couldn't bring herself to text June either. So Sydney wandered the town alone for another hour, as the sticky heat finally cooled and the crowds in costumes thinned. She kept the backpack in her hand, the zipper parted, and the gun in reach in case anyone tried anything. No one did. When she finally returned to the apartment, the lights were all off. She slipped off her shoes, heard the soft sound of a body shifting on the couch, and turned, expecting to see Mitch. But it was Victor, stretched out on the sofa, one arm across his eyes, his chest rising and falling in the slow, steady rhythm of sleep. Doll lay on the floor beside him, awake, eyes shining in the dark, tail swishing softly at her arrival. As Sydney padded across the apartment, the dog rose and followed in her wake, padding down the hall to her room and climbing up onto her bed without invitation. Sid eased the door shut and slumped back against it. A few moments later she heard the soft scrape of furniture, the sound of Victor rising, the soft tread of his own steps as he passed her door, and closed his own. He hadn't been asleep, she realized. Victor had simply been waiting for Sid to come home. Roman numeral 17. 4 weeks ago. Holloway. It was late, but Sydney wasn't tired yet. Too much sugar in her blood, too many thoughts in her head. And besides, she needed to see the birthday out as well as in. It was tradition. A memory, like a splinter, of Sid trying to stay awake as the minutes ticked toward midnight. Serena poking her in the ribs every time she started to snooze. Come on, Sid. You're almost there. It's bad luck to fall asleep. Get up and dance with me. Sydney shook her head, trying to dislodge her sister's voice. She turned in a slow circle before the mirror, letting her blue hair fan around her face, and then tugged off the wig and undid the clips beneath. Her natural hair, a curtain of straight white blonde, came free, falling almost to her shoulders. Sid caught her reflection again, but this time out of the corner of her eye. Sometimes, if she squinted a little, she could almost see someone else in the mirror. Someone with sharper cheekbones, fuller lips, a mouth tugged into a sly grin. The ghost of her sister. An echo. But then the illusion would falter and Sydney's eyes would come back into focus, and all she would see was a girl playing dress-up. Sydney shed the red bomber jacket and unlaced the steel-toed boots, turning her attention to Victor's gift. She took up the blue box and carried it to the room's small desk. Doll watched from the floor as she carefully lifted the box lid, examining the contents. The bird's small skeleton was immaculate, intact. It looked like something out of a natural history museum. Knowing Victor, it probably was. Sid sat down, ran her fingers thoughtfully over the bird's wing, and wondered how old it was. The longer a thing had been dead, she'd learned, the harder it was to bring it back. And the less of it remained, the more brittle its life was. So likely to crumble or break, and when it did, it was gone forever. No second chances. Nothing to grab hold of. Sydney glanced at the red metal tin beside her bed, and then she took up a pair of tweezers and began removing bones, erasing the bird one piece at a time, until only a few fragments remained. The long bone at the top of one wing, a section of the spine, the heel of one foot. She took a deep breath and closed her eyes, resting her hand on the partial skeleton. And then she reached. At first she felt nothing beyond the bones under her palm, but she imagined herself reaching further, deeper, past the bird and the case and the desk, plunging her hand down into cold, empty space. Her lungs began to ache. The chill spread through her fingers and up her arms, sharp and biting, and when she breathed out she could feel the plume of cold, like fog, on her lips. Light danced, far off and faint, behind her eyes, and her fingers brushed something, the barest hint of a thread. Sid pulled gently, gingerly. She kept her eyes closed, but she could feel the small skeleton beginning to rebuild, the ripple of muscle, of skin, the blush of feathers. Almost. But then she pulled just a little too hard. The thread vanished. The fragile light behind her eyes went out. Sydney blinked, withdrew her hand, and saw the remains of the bird, its fragile skeleton now beyond repair. The bones, so carefully arranged in their velvet, were split and broken, the pile she'd set aside caving in, crumbling under their own weight. She still wasn't strong enough. Still wasn't ready. When she moved to touch the bones, they fell apart, leaving only an ashy streak on the blue velvet lining, a pile of dust on her desk. Ruined, thought Sydney, sweeping the remains into the trash. Roman numeral 18. 4 weeks ago. Merritt Central Hospital. I will ruin you. I will ruin I will. Marcella opened her eyes. She was greeted by sterile fluorescent lights, the antiseptic smell of scrubbed surfaces, and the papery thread count of hospital sheets. Marcella knew she shouldn't be here, shouldn't even be alive, but her pulse registered, a wavering green line on the machine beside her head, inexorable proof that she was. She drew a deep breath, and then cringed. Her lungs and throat felt raw, her skull pounding even through the high-grade painkillers being piped into her veins. Marcella tested her fingers and toes, rolled her head gingerly side to side with calm precision, and she commended herself, startling composure. She had long ago learned to compartmentalize her feelings, shove the inconvenient and the unbecoming into the back of her mind, like an old dress in a dark closet. Her fingers crept along the sheets, and she tried to pull herself up, but at the slightest movement she was assaulted by her own body, her bruised and broken ribs, her burned and blistered skin. Marcella had also learned to embrace the various stings and aches and sears that went hand in hand with maintaining her appearance. This pain put those nips and tucks, those elected inconveniences, to shame. This pain made a home in her skin, in her bones, moved like molten fire through her blood, her limbs, but instead of cringing away, Marcella focused in. She once had a yoga instructor who compared the mind to a house. Marcella had rolled her eyes at the time, but now she imagined going room to room, switching off the lights. Here was fear. Switch. Here was panic. Switch. Here was confusion. Switch. Here was pain. Here was anger. Here was her husband, that cheating fuck. Here was him slamming her head into the table. Here was his arm sweeping the candles. Here was her voice breaking, her lungs filling with smoke. Here was his back as he walked away, and left her to die. That light she left on. She marveled at the way it grew brighter inside her head, at the warmth that came with it, rippling through her skin. Her fingers tightened on the bedrail. It went soft under her palm, the smooth metal rusting away, a red stain spreading along the steel. By the time she noticed, pulled away, a section the length of her forearm was already ruined, flaking onto the bed. Marcella stared, uncomprehending. She looked from her hand to the metal and back, felt the heat still wicking off her skin. She clutched the thin hospital sheets instead, but they crumbled too, the fabric rotting away in the span of a breath, leaving only a patina of ash behind. Marcella raised both hands now, not in surrender, but in fascination. The palms turned up toward her face, searching for an explanation, a fundamental change, and finding only her own ruined manicure, a familiar hand-shaped bruise going green around her wrist, a white hospital band with the wrong name printed on it, Melinda Pierce. Marcella frowned. The other details were all correct. She recognized her age, her date of birth, but it seemed someone had entered her into the system under a false name, which meant they didn't want Marcus to know she was here, or to know she was alive. A reasonable choice, she thought, considering the events of earlier that night. Or was it tomorrow? Time felt muddy. The wounds felt fresh enough. Without the sheets, she could see the bandages tracing their way up her legs, winding across her stomach, around her shoulder, the mirror image of a candelabra burned into her. A police radio went off, the sharp static setting it apart from the dozens of other hospital sounds. Marcella's attention flicked to the door. It was closed, but through the glass insert she spotted a cop's uniform. Slowly, Marcella managed to draw herself up from the bed, despite the various cables and cords connecting her to the medical bay. Her hand reached for the IV stand before she remembered the stretch of rusted steel, the crumbling sheet. She hesitated, but her palm felt cool again, and as her fingers closed around the plastic cord, nothing terrible happened. Gingerly, Marcella disconnected the line, and then, careful not to dislodge the heart monitor, she reached around and pulled the power cord instead. The machines went quiet, their screens black. Marcella's hospital gown hung loose, a mercy given the contact with her tender skin, but also a hindrance. She couldn't slip out wearing nothing but a sheet. A sterile white wardrobe stood in the corner, and she went to it, irrationally hoping to find her clothes, her purse, her keys, but of course it was empty. Beyond the door, she heard a gruff voice. "Still hasn't woken up." "No, we've kept it off the news." "I've already called Witsec." Marcella sneered. Witsec. She hadn't designed this life, built a future from nothing just to spend it hiding, and she'd be damned if she disappeared before her husband. Marcella turned, surveying the room. There was nothing but the one door, and a window looking out over Merritt from at least 6 stories up. One room, one door, one window, and 2 walls. Marcella picked the one opposite her bed, pressed her ear to the wall, and heard nothing, just the steady beep of more hospital equipment. She brought her fingers to the plaster, barely touching. Nothing happened. Slowly, Marcella pressed her palm flat against the wall.
Nothing. She glared at her hand. The nails cracked where her desperate fingers had dug into the silk-threaded carpet, clawed at the wood floor. Her hand began to glow. Marcella watched the wall beneath her fingers, warping, rotting, drywall slouching, as if with damp, or gravity, or time, until a broad hole formed between the rooms, large enough to step through. Marcella marveled, then, at her hand, at the damage it had done. So it wasn't a matter of force, but feeling. That was fine. Marcella had quite a lot of feelings. She drew the power back into her chest as if it were a breath. There it burned, less like a fuse than a pilot light, steady and waiting. Marcella stepped through the ruined wall and into the next room. The door to the room was ajar, and the woman in the bed, Alice Tolinsky, according to the clipboard, was 3 inches shorter than Marcella, and a good 30 pounds heavier. Her clothes hung in the small, hospital-issued wardrobe. Marcella wrinkled her nose as she considered the slip-on flats, the frills on the collar of the flower-printed blouse, the jeans with their elastic waist. But beggars couldn't be choosers. Marcella was grateful for the room and the jeans when she had to pull them on. She stifled a breath as the denim grazed her bandages, then turned her attention back to the closet. A knockoff leather purse slumped on the shelf. Marcella rifled through the contents and came up with $100 in cash and a pair of glasses. She finished getting dressed, tugged her hair into a bun at the nape of her neck, slipped on the glasses, and stepped into the hall. The cop in front of her door was picking at a bandage on his hand. He didn't look up as Marcella turned and left. A queue of taxis waited outside the hospital. She climbed into the nearest one.
Address,
rumbled the driver.
The Heights.
It was the first time she'd spoken, and her voice was raw from smoke, a fraction lower and edged with the luscious rasp that so many starlets craved. On Grand. The car pulled away, and Marcella leaned back against the leather seat. She had always been good under pressure. Other women could afford to panic, but being a mob wife required a certain level of poise. It meant staying calm, or at least feigning calm. At the moment, Marcella didn't feel like she was feigning anything. There was no fear, no doubt. Her head wasn't spinning. She didn't feel lost. If anything, this road she was on felt paved and straight, the end lit by a single blinding light, and beneath that light stood Marcus Andover Riggins. 2. Revelation. Roman numeral 1. 14 years ago. University of Merit. Everyone was shit-faced. Marcella sat on the kitchen counter, her heels knocking absently against the cabinets as she watched them stumble past, sloshing drinks and shouting to be heard. The house was filled with music, bodies, stale booze, and cheap cologne, and all the other inane trappings of a college frat party. Her friends had convinced her to come, with the weak argument that it was just what students did, that there would be free beer and hot guys, and it would be fun. Those same girls were lost somewhere in the mass of bodies. Every now and then, she thought she caught a glimpse of a familiar blonde bob, a high brown ponytail. Then again, there were a dozen of them, cookie-cutter college kids, more concerned with blending in than standing out. Marcella Renee Morgan was not having fun. She was nursing a beer in a glass bottle, and she was bored. Bored by the music, and the boys who swaggered over every now and then to flirt and then stormed away, sulking, when she turned them down. She was bored by being called beautiful, and then a bitch. Stunning, and then stuck up. A 10, and then a tease. Marcella had always been pretty. The kind of pretty people couldn't ignore. Bright blue eyes and pitch-black hair, a heart-shaped face atop the lean, clean lines of a model. Her father told her she'd never have to work. Her mother said she'd have to work twice as hard. In a way, both of them were right. Her body was the first thing people saw. For most, it seemed to be the last thing, too.
You think you're better than me?
A drunken senior had slurred at her earlier. Marcella had looked at him straight on, his eyes bleary, hers sharp, and said simply,
Yes.
Bitch, he'd muttered, storming away. Predictable. Marcella had promised her friend she'd stay for a drink. She tipped the bottle back, eager to finish the beer.
I see you found the good stuff,
said a deep voice, rich, with a faint southern lilt. She glanced up and saw a guy leaning back against the kitchen island. Marcella didn't know what he was talking about, not until he nodded at the glass bottle in her hand, with the plastic cup in his own. She gestured at the fridge. He crossed to it, retrieving 2 more bottles. He cracked them open against the counter's edge, and offered one to her. Marcella took it, considering him over the rim. His eyes were dark blue, his hair sun-kissed, that warm shade between blonde and brown. Most of the guys at the party hadn't shed their baby fat, high school still clinging to them like wet clothes. But his black shirt stretched tight over strong shoulders, and his jaw was sharp, a small cleft denting his chin. Marcus, he said by way of introduction. She knew who he was. She'd seen him on campus. But it was Alice who'd told her Marcus Riggins was trouble, Not because he was gorgeous, not because he was rich, nothing so bland as all that. No, Marcus was trouble for one simple, delicious reason. His family was in the mob. Alice had said it like it was a bad thing, a deal-breaker. But if anything, it only piqued her interest. "Marcella," she said, uncrossing and recrossing her legs. He smiled. "Marcus and Marcella," he said, lifting his drink. "We sound like a matching set." Someone turned the music up, and his next words were lost under the bass.
"What did you say?"
She called over the song, and he took the opportunity to close the gap between them. She shifted her legs to the side, and he stepped closer, smelling like apples and linen, clean and crisp. Such a welcome change from the sticky, tacky grime of lazy, drunken bodies. He rested his beer on the counter just beside her arm, the cold glass brushing her elbow and sending a small shiver through her. A slow smile crossed his face. He leaned in close, as if telling her a secret. "Follow me." He stepped back, taking the scent of linen and the blush of heat with him. He didn't pull her off the counter, but she felt pulled, drawn in his wake as he turned away, slipped through the crowd. She followed him, through the party, up the stairs, down the hall to a bedroom door. "Still with me?" he asked, glancing back. The door swung open onto a room at odds with the rest of the frat house. The laundry was hampered, the desk clean, the bed made. The only clutter a neat stack of books on the comforter. Marcella hovered in the doorway, waiting to see what he'd do next, if he would come to her, or make her come to him. Instead, Marcus went to the window, slid up the glass, and stepped out onto a widow's walk. A fall breeze whispered through the room as Marcella followed, slipping off her heels. Marcus offered his hand and helped her up and through. The city spiraled away beneath them, the darkened buildings a sky, the lights like stars. Merritt always looked larger at night. Marcus sipped his beer. "Better?" Marcella smiled. "Better?" The music, obnoxiously loud downstairs, was now a muted pulse against her back. Marcus leaned against the wooden rail. "You from here?"
"Not far," she said. "You?"
"Born and raised," he said. "What are you studying?"
"Business,"
she said shortly. Marcella hated small talk, but that was because so often it felt like a chore. Just noise, empty words meant to fill empty space.
"Why did you bring me up here?"
"I didn't," he said, all mock innocence.
"You followed me."
"You asked,"
she said, realizing he hadn't. There'd been no question in his voice, only a simple command.
"You were about to leave,"
said Marcus,
"and I didn't want you to."
Marcella considered him.
"Are you used to getting what you want?"
The edge of a smile.
"I have a feeling we both are."
He returned her long look.
"Marcella, the business major. What do you want to be?"
Marcella twirled her beer.
"In charge."
Marcus laughed, a soft, breathy sound.
"You think I'm joking?"
"No," he said. "I don't."
"How do you know?"
"Because," he said, closing the narrow space between them, "we are a matching set." The breeze cut through, just crisp enough to make her shiver.
"We better go inside,"
said Marcus, pulling away. He stepped back through the window, offering his hand, but this time he didn't lead.
"After you,"
he said, gesturing toward the bedroom door. It was still cracked open, music and laughter pouring up from the party below. But when Marcella reached the door, she hesitated, fingers coming to rest against the wood. She could picture Marcus standing a few feet behind her, hands in his pockets, waiting to see what she would do. She pushed the door shut. The lock caught with a soft click, and Marcus was there as if summoned, lips brushing the back of her neck. His hand slid, feather light, over her shoulders, against her waist. Heat flooded through her at the almost touch.
"I won't break,"
she said, turning in time to catch Marcus's mouth with hers. He pressed into her, pushed her back against the wood. Her nails dug into his arms as he unbuttoned his shirt. His teeth scraped her shoulder as her own came off. They laid waste to the order of his room, shedding clothes, knocking over a chair, a lamp, sweeping the books from the bed as Marcus pressed her down into the sheets. They fit together perfectly. A matching set. Roman numeral 2. 4 weeks ago. Downtown Merritt. The cab stopped in front of the Heights, a pale stone spire seated in the heart of the city. Marcella paid the driver in cash and climbed out, her limbs a dull roar of pain with every step. When she had first discovered the secret apartment, on a goddamn bank statement, she'd assumed the worst, but Marcus had claimed the place was purely practical. A safe house. He'd even insisted on bringing her there, showing off his thorough work, her favorite designer labels in the closet, her brand of coffee in the cupboard, her shampoo in the shower. And Marcella had actually believed him. Found a way to make it their secret instead of his. Now and then she'd phone him up, insisting there was some emergency and he'd somberly order her to meet him at the safe house, and he'd arrive to find her waiting wearing nothing but a gold ribbon carefully wrapped and finished with a bow. Now the image of the tawdry pink lipstick flared like pain behind Marcella's eyes. What a fool. The concierge rose from the front desk to greet her. "Mrs. Riggins," said Ainsley, surprise lighting his face. He glanced quickly at her ill-fitting clothes, the bandages peeking out from collar and cuff. But the residents at the Heights paid for discretion as much as floor-to-ceiling windows. Now Marcella wondered how many times Ainsley had employed that same discretion with her husband. "Is everything all right?" he ventured. She flicked a wrist dismissively. "It's a long story." And then after a moment, "Marcus isn't here, is he?" "No, ma'am," he said solemnly. "Good," said Marcella. "I'm afraid I've forgotten my keys." Ainsley nodded briskly and rounded the desk to summon the elevator. When the doors opened, he followed her inside. As it rose, she rubbed her forehead, as if simply tired, and asked the date. The concierge told her, and Marcella stiffened. She'd been in the hospital for almost 2 weeks. But that didn't matter, not now. What mattered was that it was a Friday night. She knew exactly where Marcus would be. The elevator stopped. Ainsley followed her out onto the 14th floor, unlocked the cream-colored door, and wished her a pleasant night. Marcella waited until he was gone, then stepped inside and flicked on the lights. "Honey, I'm home," she cooed to the empty apartment. She should have felt something, a pang of sorrow or regret, but there was only the ache in her skin and the rising tide of anger beneath, and when she reached for one of the wine glasses on the counter, it warped under her touch and turned to sand. 1,000 grains rained down Marcella's glowing fingers, spilled onto the floor. She stared down at her hand, the remains of the glass dusting her palm. The strange light was already sinking back beneath her skin, and when she reached for a fresh glass, it held under her touch. A bottle of Chardonnay sat chilling in the fridge, and Marcella poured herself a drink and flicked on the news, now eager to know what she'd missed, as she clicked the volume up and headed for the bedroom. One of Marcus's shirts lay thrown across the bed, along with one of her own. The glass in her hand threatened to give, so Marcella set it aside. The doors to the walk-in closet were thrown wide, Marcus's dark suits lining one wall, while the rest was given over to a medley of couture dresses, blouses, heels. Marcella glanced back at the clothes, still twined in a lover's embrace atop the bed, and felt her anger rising like steam. Fingers glowing, she ran her hand along her husband's side of the closet, and watched the garments fade and rot under her touch. Cotton, silk, and wool, all withered and dropped from the hangers, crumbling by the time they hit the floor. Hell hath no fury, she thought, dusting her palms. Satisfied, no, not satisfied, nowhere near satisfied, but momentarily appeased, Marcella took up her drink and went into the luxury bathroom, where she set the glass on the rim of the marble sink and began to peel away the frumpy stolen clothes. She stripped until she was dressed in nothing but bandages. The sterile white wrappings weren't nearly as seductive as the gold ribbons, but they seemed to trace the same path across her leg, her stomach, her arms, marking her, mocking her. Marcella's hands twitched with a sudden urge to reach out and ruin something, anything. Instead, she stood there and took in her reflection, every angle, every flaw, memorized it while she waited for the rage to pass. Not vanish, no, simply retract, like a cat's claws. If this new power was temporary, a thing with limits, she didn't want to pass them. She needed her nails sharp. The painkillers from the hospital were wearing off, and her head was ringing. So Marcella dug 2 Vicodin out of her emergency supply beneath the sink, washed them down with the last of the Chardonnay, and went to get ready. Roman numeral 3. 8 years ago. Uptown. The phone rang, and rang, and rang. "Don't answer it," said Marcus, pacing. A dark tie hung loose, unknotted, around his neck. "Darling," said Marcella, sitting on the edge of the bed. "You knew they'd call." He'd been on edge for days, weeks, waiting for the phone to ring. They both knew who it would be. Anthony Edward Hutch, one of the 4 heads of the Merit Crime Syndicate, and Jack Riggins' long-term benefactor. Marcus had finally told her, of course, what his father did. How for them the word family wasn't just about blood. It was a profession. He told her in their senior year of college. Looked like death when he said it. And Marcella had realized halfway through the meal that he was trying to break up with her. "Is it like joining the clergy?" she'd asked, sipping her wine. "Did you take a vow of celibacy?" "What?" "No," he said, confused. "Then why can't we face it together?" Marcus shook his head. "I'm trying to protect you." "Hasn't it occurred to you that I can protect myself?" "This isn't like in the movies, Marcella. What my family does, it's brutal and bloody. In this world, in my world, people get hurt. They die." Marcella blinked, set down her glass, leaned in,
People die in every world, Marcus. I'm not going anywhere.
2 weeks later, he'd proposed. Marcella adjusted the diamond on her finger as the phone stopped ringing. A few seconds later, it started again. I'm not answering it.
So don't.
I don't have a choice, he snapped, running a hand through his sun-streaked hair. Marcella rose to her feet and took his hand.
Huh,
she said, holding it up between them.
I don't see any strings.
Marcus pulled free. You don't know what it's like, having other people decide who you are, what you're going to be. Marcella resisted the urge to roll her eyes. Of course she knew. People looked at her and assumed a whole lot. That a pretty face meant an empty head, that a girl like her was only after an easy life, that she would be satisfied with luxury instead of power, as if you couldn't want both. Her own mother had told her to aim high, that she should never sell herself cheap. The correct saying, of course, was short, as in don't sell yourself short, but Marcella hadn't sold herself cheap or short. She'd chosen Marcus Riggins, and he was going to choose this. The phone rang on and on.
Take the call.
If I take the call, he said, I take the job. If I take the job, I'm in. There's no getting back out. Marcella caught him by the shoulder, interrupting the pendulum of his movement. He faltered, drew up short as she wrapped her fingers around his silk tie, and pulled him toward her. Something flashed in Marcus's eyes, anger and fear and violence, and Marcella knew that he could do this job, and do it well. Marcus wasn't weak, wasn't soft. He was simply stubborn, which was why he needed her. Because where he saw a trap, she saw an opportunity.
What do you want to be?
Asked Marcella. The same question he'd asked her the night they met. One Marcus himself had never answered. Now he looked at her, his eyes dark. I want to be more.
Then be more.
That, she said, turning his face toward the phone,
is just a door. A way in.
Her nails scraped against his cheek.
You want to be more, Marcus? Prove it. Pick up the phone and walk through the goddamn door.
The ringing stopped, and in the silence she could hear her quickening pulse and his unsteady breath. The moment stretched taut, and then collapsed. They collided, Marcus kissing her hard and deep, one hand already sliding between her legs, the other dragging the nails from his cheek. He spun her around, bent her over the bed. He was already hard. She was already wet. Marcella stifled a gasp of pleasure, triumph, as he pressed himself against her, into her, her fingers knotting in the sheets, her gaze drifting to the cell phone beside her on the bed. And when it rang again, Marcus answered. Roman numeral 4. 4 weeks ago. The Heights. Marcella longed for a hot shower, but the first touch of water sent a searing pain over her tender skin, so instead she settled for a damp cloth, drawing lukewarm water from the bathroom sink. The edges of her hair were singed beyond repair, so she took up the sharpest scissors she could find and started to cut. When she was done, her black waves ended just above her shoulders. A thick coil swept across her brow, hiding the fresh scar above her left temple and framing her face. Her face, which had miraculously escaped the worst of the fight and the fire. She brushed mascara along her lashes and painted a fresh coat of red on her lips. Pain followed every gesture, every stretch and bend of tender skin, a reminder in the shape of her husband's name. But through it all, Marcella's mind felt quiet, smooth, silk ribbons instead of knotted rope. She returned to the closet, running her fingers lightly along the symphony of clothes that made up her wardrobe. A small, vindictive part of her wanted to choose something revealing, to put her injuries on display. But she knew better. Weakness was a thing best concealed. In the end, she chose a pair of elegant black slacks, a silk blouse that wrapped around her sleek frame, and a pair of black stilettos, the heels as thin and chrome as switchblades. She was just fastening the buckles on her second shoe when a newscaster's voice rose from the television in the other room. New developments in the case of the house fire that raged through the upscale Brighton development last week. She stepped out into the hall, in time to see her own face on the screen, resulting in the death of Marcella Renee Riggins. She had been right then. The police obviously wanted Marcus to believe she was dead, which was probably the only reason she wasn't. Marcella took up the remote, turning up the volume as the camera cut to a shot of their house, the exterior charred and smoldering. Officials have yet to determine the cause of the fire, but it's believed to be an accident. Marcella's grip tightened on the remote as the camera cut to a shot of Marcus, running his hands through his hair. The picture of grief. Husband Marcus Riggins admitted to police that the two had quarreled earlier that night, and that his wife was prone to outbursts, but adamantly denied the suggestion that she'd set the fire herself, saying that she had never been violent or destructive. The remote crumbled in her hand, batteries liquefying as the plastic warped and melted. Marcella let the mess fall from her fingers and went to find her husband. Roman numeral 5. 3 years ago. Downtown Merritt. Marcella had always liked the National Building. It was a feat of glass and steel, a 30-story prism at the heart of the city. She'd coveted it, the way one might a diamond, and Tony Hutch owned the whole thing, from the marble lobby all the way to the rooftop gardens where he threw his parties. They stepped through the front doors arm in arm, Marcus in a trim black suit, Marcella in a gold dress. She caught sight of a plainclothes cop lounging in the lobby and shot him a toying wink. Half the Merritt PD was in Hutch's pocket. The other half couldn't get close enough to do a damn thing. The inside of the elevator was polished to a high shine, and as it rose, Marcella leaned against Marcus and considered their reflection. She loved the way they looked together. She loved his strong jaw and his rough hands, loved his steely blue eyes and the way he moaned her name. They were partners in crime, a perfect pair.
"Hello, handsome,"
she said, catching his eye. He smiled.
Hello, gorgeous.
Yes, she loved her husband, probably more than she should. The elevator doors opened onto a rooftop covered in lights and music and laughter. Hutch always knew how to throw a party. Gauzy canopies and sofas piled with cushions, low golden glass tables, servers slipping through the crowd with champagne flutes and canapes. But what drew Marcella's eye more than any of it was the city beyond. The view was incredible, the National high enough up that it seemed to look down on all of Merritt. Marcus led her through the bustling crowd. As they moved, she felt the eyes of every man, and half the women slide over her. Marcella's dress, made of 1,000 pale gold scales, hugged her every curve and shimmered with each step. Her heels and nails were the same pale gold, as was the matching net of wire woven through her black hair, lacing tiny white gold beads through the glossy updo. The only spots of color were her eyes, a vivid blue framed by black lashes, and her lips, which she'd painted crimson. Marcus had told her to dress up.
What's the point of having beautiful things, he'd said, if you don't put them on display?
Now he led her to the very center of the roof, to the marble star inlaid in the floor where the boss himself was holding court. Anthony Hutch. He wasn't unattractive, lean and strong, with warm brown hair, and a constant summer tan, but there was something about him that made Marcella's skin crawl.
Tony, you've met my wife, Marcella.
Hutch's attention, when it landed on her, felt like a damp hand on bare flesh.
Jesus, Mark, he said. Does she come with a warning label?
"She does not,"
quipped Marcella, but Hutch only smiled.
Seriously, though, how could I forget such a beauty?
He stepped closer.
Is Mark here treating you well? You need anything, you just let me know.
"Why?"
asked Marcella with a smirk.
"Are you in the market for a wife?"
Hutch chuckled and spread his arms.
Unfortunately, I like catching girls more than keeping them.
"That simply means,"
said Marcella,
"you haven't found the right one."
Hutch laughed and turned toward Marcus.
You got yourself a keeper.
Marcus looped his arms around her waist and kissed her temple.
Don't I know it?
But his body was already twisting away from her, and soon Marcella found herself pushed to the outside of the circles as the group of men began to talk business.
We're looking to expand our hold on the south side.
Territory moves are always dangerous.
Caprese's eyes are bigger than his stomach.
"You could squeeze him out more subtly,"
offered Marcella.
"Pick up the blocks around him. It wouldn't be a direct attack. No grounds for retaliation, but the message is clear."
The conversation crumbled. The men went quiet. After a pained moment, Marcus simply smiled.
My wife, the business major,
he said blandly. Marcella felt herself flush as the other men shared a knowing chuckle. Hutch looked at her, his own laugh slack, hollow.
Marcella, we must be boring you. I'm sure you'd be happier with the other wives.
Marcella's answer was already poised on her lips, but Marcus cut in first.
Go on, Mars,
he said, kissing her cheek.
Let the man talk.
She wanted to grab his jaw, dig her nails in until they drew blood. Instead, she smiled, arranged her face into a mask of serenity. Appearance was everything.
"Of course,"
she said.
"I'll leave you boys to it."
She turned away, plucked a champagne flute from a passing server, held the glass so tight her fingers hurt. She felt their eyes follow her across the roof. What's the point of having beautiful things if you don't put them on display? She hadn't realized, at the time, that Marcus had referred to her as a thing. The comment had slid off like a silk gown, pretty and weightless, but...
"Marcella!"
called a woman in a familiar sing-song voice. Her heels were pushing 6 inches, which was probably why she was sitting down, holding court in a dark red gown. It was the perfect color. Grace was blonde and fair, and the dress stood out like blood on skin.
"Have you been evicted?"
asked Teresa, seated as well and sipping a large drink.
"God, no,"
said Marcella.
"They were boring me to tears."
"Too much shop talk,"
said Bethany. bangles clanging as she flicked her wrist. More beauty than brains in that one, thought Marcella, not for the first time.
They may think they're kings, said Grace, but we're the power behind the throne.
A tinkle of laughter sounded nearby. There was a second group of women clustered in another corner of the roof, in higher heels and shorter dresses. The girlfriends, the second, third wives, the side pieces, newer models, Grace would say.
How's Marcus? Asked Bethany. I hope you're keeping him on a leash.
Oh, she said, sipping her champagne. He'd never cheat.
What makes you so sure? Asked Teresa.
Marcella met Marcus's eyes across the roof. Because, she said, raising her glass.
He knows I'd kill him first. Did you have a nice night?
Marcella asked later as the car pulled away from the party. Marcus was all energy. It went off without a hitch, or a hutch. He chuckled at his own joke. Marcella didn't. He's taken a liking to me, I can tell. Said he'd call me in the morning. Something new. Something big. He pulled her close. You were right.
I'm always right,
she said absently, looking out the window.
Let's stay in the city tonight.
Good idea, said Marcus. He knocked on the partition, gave the driver the address of their place at the Heights, told him to hurry. And then he sat back, pressing against her. They couldn't take their eyes off you. I don't blame them. Neither could I.
Not here,
she said, trying to force a little humor in her voice.
You'll ruin my dress.
Fuck your dress. He breathed in her ear. I want you. But Marcella pushed him away. What's wrong? He asked. Marcella's gaze flicked toward him.
My wife, the business major.
He rolled his eyes. Mars.
Let the men talk.
Oh, come on.
You made a fool of me.
He made a sound too close to a laugh. Don't you think you're overreacting? Marcella gritted her teeth.
You're very lucky I didn't react at the time.
Marcus soured. This isn't a good look on you, Mars. The car pulled up in front of the Heights, and Marcella resisted the urge to storm out. She flicked open the door and rose, smoothing the gold scales on her dress as she waited for Marcus to round the car. Good evening, said the concierge. Nice night.
Flawless,
said Marcella, stepping briskly into the elevator, Marcus in her wake. He waited until the doors were closed, then sighed, shook his head. You know what those guys are like, he muttered. Old guard, old money, old values. You wanted this. You wanted me to do this.
With me, she snapped. I wanted us to do this together.
He tried to cut in, but she didn't let him.
I'm not a fucking coat, Marcus. You don't get to check me at the door.
The elevator stopped, and she strode out into the hall, heels clicking on the marble floor. She reached their door, but Marcus caught her hand and pinned her back against the wood. On a normal night, she would have thrilled at the swift display of strength, would have arched against him. But she wasn't in the mood. Let the men talk. Marcella. The laugh, the patronizing smiles. Marcella, said Marcus, drawing her face toward his. Her gaze toward his. And then she saw it. Or maybe she just wanted to see it. There, beyond the flat, dark blue. A glimpse of the Marcus she'd met, young and hungry, and utterly in love with her. The Marcus who wanted her, needed her. His mouth hovered a breath from hers as he spoke. Where I go, you go, he said. We're in this together. Step for step. Marcella wanted to believe him, needed to believe him, because she wasn't willing to let go, wasn't going to lose him, everything she'd built. They never seemed to realize. We're the power behind the throne. Marcella leaned forward and kissed him long and slow and deep. Show me, she said, leading him inside. Roman numeral 6. 4 weeks ago. Merritt suburbs. Marcus Andover Riggins had always been a man of routines. An espresso in the morning, a bourbon before bed. Every Monday after breakfast he got a massage, and every Wednesday at lunch he swam laps, and every Friday night, rain or shine, from dusk until dawn, he played poker. 4 or 5 members of Tony Hutch's crew all got together weekly at Sam McGuire's place, since Sam was single, or at least he wasn't married. He had a rotation of sorts, a new girl every week, but none of them stuck. Sam's was a nice place. They were all nice places. But he had a bad habit of leaving the back door unlocked instead of giving any of his short-term girls a key. Marcella had warned him a dozen times. Someone could walk right in. But Sam would just smile and say that no man would walk in on one of Tony Hutch's crew. Perhaps. But Marcella Riggins was no man. She let herself inside. The back door gave onto the kitchen, where Marcella found a girl doubled over, ass in the air and head in the freezer as she rummaged for ice. She wobbled in 2 high heels, bangles clanging against the freezer. But the first thing Marcella noticed was the girl's dress. Dark blue silk, with a short rippling skirt, the same one that had hung for more than a year in Marcella's own closet at the Heights. The girl straightened and turned, her mouth forming a perfect pink circle. Bethany. Bethany, who had twice as many tits as thoughts. Bethany, who asked about Marcus every time they met. Bethany, who looked like a cheap knockoff of Marcella in those diamond earrings, that stolen dress, which wasn't stolen, of course, because the apartment in town had also been kept for her. Bethany's eyes went wide.
Marcella? Did you always know,
she'd asked Marcus once, undoing the buttons on a blood-stained shirt,
that you had what it took to end a life?
Not until the gun was in my hand, he'd said. I thought it would be hard. But in that moment, nothing was easier. He was right. But there was, it turned out, a crucial difference between destroying things and destroying people. People screamed. Or at least they tried. Bethany certainly would have, if Marcella hadn't already grabbed her by the throat, hadn't eroded through her vocal cords before anything more than a short, futile gasp could escape. And even then, the men in the other room might have heard, if they hadn't been laughing so loudly. It didn't take long. 1 second, Bethany's mouth was open in a perfect O of surprise, and the next, her plump skin had shriveled, her face twisting into a rictus grin that quickly pulled away to reveal the skull beneath, and then even that turned to ash, as all that was left of Bethany crumbled to the kitchen floor. It was over so fast, there was hardly any time for Marcella to savor what she'd done, and no time to think about all the things she should be feeling, given the circumstances, or even to wonder at their peculiar absence. It was just so easy, as if everything had wanted to come apart. There was probably some law about that. Order giving way to chaos. Marcella took up a dishcloth and wiped the dust from her fingers as another raucous laugh cut through the house. Then a familiar voice called out, "Doll, where's that drink?" Marcella followed the voice down the short hall that ran between the kitchen and the den, where the men were playing. "Where the fuck is my drink?" bellowed Marcus, chair scraping back. He was on his feet when she walked in. "Hello, boys." Marcus didn't have to feign surprise, since he'd expected her to be dead. His face drained of all color. What was the phrase? Oh, yes. As if he'd just seen a ghost. The other 4 men squinted through the haze of liquor and cigar smoke. "Mars," said her husband, voice laced with shock. Oh, how she longed to kill him. But she wanted to use her bare hands, and there was a table between them, and Marcus was holding his ground, looking at her with a mixture of suspicion and worry. And Marcella knew what she had to do. She began to cry. It was easy. All she had to do was think of her life, the one she'd worked so hard for, going up in flames. "I've been so worried," she said, breath hitching. "I woke up in a hospital, and you weren't there. The cops said there'd been a fire, and I was afraid. They wouldn't tell me if you'd been hurt in it. They wouldn't tell me anything." His expression flickered, suddenly uncertain. He took a step toward her. "I thought you were dead." A forced stammer, a mockery of emotion. "The cops wouldn't let me see you. I thought maybe you... What do you remember, baby?" Still the pet names. Marcella shook her head. "I remember making dinner. Everything after that is a blur." She caught a glimpse of hope in his eyes, amazement that he would get away with it, that he could have the best of both worlds, killing his wife and getting her back. But instead of coming to her, he sank down into his chair. "By the time I got home," he said, "the fire trucks were there. The house was up in flames. They wouldn't let me in." Marcus slumped back, as if reliving the trauma, the grief, as if 10 minutes earlier he hadn't been playing poker and waiting for his mistress, her one-time friend, to bring him his drink. Marcella went to her husband, circled behind his chair, and wrapped her arms around his shoulders. "I'm just so glad." He took up her hand, pressed his lips against her wrist. "I'm all right, doll." She nestled her face into his collar, felt Marcus actually relax, muscles unwinding as he realized he was in the clear. "Guys," said Marcus, "game's over." The other men shuffled, about to rise. "No," she whispered in her sweetest voice. "Stay. This won't take long." Marcus tipped his head back, a furrow between his brows. Marcella smiled. "You never were one to dwell on the past, Marcus. I loved that about you, the way things always just rolled off." She lifted an empty glass from the table. "To my husband," she said, right before the ruin rushed to her fingers in a blossom of red light. The glass dissolved, sand raining onto the felt poker table. A ripple of shock went through the table, and Marcus jerked forward, as if to rise. But Marcella had no intentions of letting go. "We've had a good run," she whispered in his ear, as the anger and hurt and hatred rose like heat. She let it all out. Her husband had told her 100 stories about the way men died. No one ever held their tongue, not in the end. In the end, they begged and pleaded, sobbed and screamed. Marcus was no exception. It didn't last long, not out of some sudden mercy. Marcella simply lacked the control to draw it out. She really would have liked to savor it, would have liked the chance to memorize his horrified face, but alas, that was the first thing to go. She had to settle instead for the shock and terror on the faces of the other men. Of course, that didn't last very long either. Two of them, Sam, of course, and another man she didn't recognize, were scrambling to their feet. Marcella sighed, her husband's remains collapsing as she knocked them aside and caught Sam's sleeve.
"Going so soon?"
she asked, ruin surging to her fingers. He staggered, fell, his body breaking by the time it hit the floor. The other man drew a knife from a hidden fold in his coat, but when he lunged toward Marcella, she wrapped one glowing hand around the blade. It decayed and crumbled, ruin spreading in an instant from metal to hilt, and then up the man's arm. He began to scream and pulled away, but the rot was already going through him like a wildfire, his body falling apart even as he tried to escape. The last two men stayed seated at the card table, their hands up and their faces frozen. All Marcella's life, men had looked at her with lust, desire. But this was different. This was fear, and it felt good. She took her husband's seat, settling in among his still warm ashes. She used a kerchief to clear a streak of him from the poker table.
"Well,"
said Marcella after a long moment.
"Deal me in."
Roman numeral 7. 4 weeks ago. Eastern Merit. Growing up, Dominic Rusher had never been a morning person. But the Army made him a get-the-fuck-up-when-you-hear-the-sound person. And anyway, sleep hadn't come easy since his accident, so Dom was on his feet by the third wail of the 4:30 a.m. alarm. He showered, wiped away the fog on the bathroom mirror, and found his reflection. 5 years had done a lot of good. Gone was the harrowed look of someone in constant pain, the gaunt features of a man trying and failing to self-medicate. In his place was a soldier, lean muscles winding over broad shoulders, tan arms strong and back straight, his hair cropped short on the sides, slicked back on top. He'd gotten his shit together, too. His medals were mounted on the wall, no longer thrown carelessly around the necks of empty liquor bottles. Next to them hung the x-rays, each metal plate and bar, pin and screw. Every way they'd put Dominic back together, glowing white against the backdrop of muscles and skin. The place was clean, and Dom was clean. He hadn't had a drink or a dose since the night they dug up Victor. He wished he could say, since the night they met, when Victor erased his pain. But the bastard had gone and died, left Dom high and dry, and in a world of hurt. Those had been 2 dark nights, ones he didn't want to remember. But Dominic's control hadn't faltered since. Even when Victor shorted out and the pain came rushing back, Dom white-knuckled it, tried to treat the episodes as a reminder, the reprieves as a gift. After all, it could be worse. It had been worse. Dom wolfed down a cup of too-hot coffee and a plate of 2 runny eggs, slung on his jacket, grabbed his helmet from the door, and stepped out into the gray pre-dawn. His ride sat waiting in its usual spot, a simple black motorcycle, nothing fancy but the kind of thing he'd always wanted growing up and never been able to afford. Dom wiped the dew from the seat before swinging his leg over, kicking it into gear, and savored the low purr for a moment before setting off. He rode through the empty streets as Merritt began to wake around him. This early, most of the streetlights were in his favor, and Dom was out of the city in 10 minutes. Merritt tapered off to either side before giving way to empty fields. The sun rose at his back as the engine screamed beneath him and the wind buffeted his helmet, and for 15 minutes he felt totally free. He hit the turnoff and slowed, easing his bike down an unmarked road. Another 5 minutes and Dom passed through an open gate, slowing as the building came into sight. From the outside it looked like nothing at all. A hospital, perhaps, or a processing plant. A set of white blocks stacked together in a nondescript formation. The kind of place you drive by without a second glance, unless you knew what it was. If you knew what it was, it became something far more ominous. Dominic parked and dismounted, climbing the front steps. The doors parted onto a pristine white hall, sterile to the point of purity. An officer stood on either side, one manning an x-ray, the other a scanner. "I've got parts," Dom reminded them, gesturing down his side. The guy nodded, tapping away at the screen, while Dominic set his phone, keys, jacket, and helmet in the tray. He stepped into the machine, waiting for the band of white light to scan up and then back down before reclaiming his possessions on the other side. He performed each task with an ease born from habit. Amazing how things became normal. Actions pressed into memory. The locker room was the first door on the right. Dom set his jacket and helmet on a shelf and changed into a black uniform shirt, high-collared and long-sleeved. He washed his face, smoothed his hair, and patted his front pocket to make sure he had his access key. Down the hall, and 2 floors up, he swiped himself into the control room, and showed the senior officer the front of his key, where his face hung in holographic detail, right below the word Eon. "Dominic Rusher," he said with an easy smile. "Reporting for duty." Roman numeral 8. 4 weeks ago. Merritt Suburbs. Stell ducked under the yellow crime scene tape. He didn't flash a badge. Didn't need to. Everyone on the scene worked for Eon. For him. Agent Holtz was standing by the back door. "Sir," he said eagerly, his tone too bright for the early hour. "Who called it in?" asked Stell.
Good Samaritan called the cops. Cops called us.
"That obvious?"
Oh, yeah,"
said Holtz, holding open the door. Agent Rios was already in the kitchen. Tall, tan, and keen-eyed, she'd been Stell's second in command for nearly 4 years. She was leaning against the counter, arms crossed, watching a tech photograph a pile of something on the tile floor. A large diamond glinted amid the mess.
"Same profile as the hospital?" asked Stell.
"Looks like it,"
said Rios.
"Marcella Riggins, age 32. Spent the last 13 days in a coma after her husband tried to burn down their house, with her inside. Can't really blame her for being mad."
"Mad is conceivable,"
said Stell.
"Murder is a problem."
He looked around.
"How many dead?"
Rios straightened. 4, we think. It's kind of hard to tell.
She pointed at the kitchen floor.
1,
she counted, and turned and led him down the hall to a room with a poker table and a fairly grisly tableau.
2,
she said, nodding down at a ruined body on the floor.
3,
she pointed at a withered form only vaguely human.
and 4,
she said, gesturing to a pile of dust that coated the back of a chair and spilled onto the felt table.
Hell hath no fury.
Stell counted the chairs.
"Survivors?"
If there were, they didn't go to the cops. The house belongs to Sam McGuire,
said Rios.
Safe to assume he's here, somewhere.
Holtz whistled from the doorway.
You ever seen anything like this before?
Stell considered. He had seen a lot since his first introduction to EOs, a decade and a half before. Vale, with his ability to modulate pain. Cardale, with his ability to regenerate. Clarke, with her ability to control. And those were just the start. The tip of the iceberg. He'd since seen EOs who could bend time, move through walls, light themselves on fire, turn themselves to stone. But this, Stell had to admit, was something new. He ran his hand through the mess on the felt.
"What is this? Ash?"
As far as we can tell, said Rios, it's Marcus Riggins. What's left of him. Or maybe this is. Or this.
"All right," said Stell, brushing the dust from his palms.
"Compile the record. I want records of everything. Everything from the hospital, everything from here. Shots and specs of every body, every room, every detail. Even if you don't think it matters. It goes in the file."
Holtz raised his hand like a schoolboy. It was impossible to forget that he was new.
Who's the file for?
"Our analyst,"
said Stell. But he knew how the agents and techs liked to talk.
You might have heard him called the hunting dog.
"Well," said Holtz, looking around, "would it be easier to bring your dog to the scene instead of trying to take the whole scene to the dog?"
"Perhaps,"
said Stell.
"But his leash doesn't reach this far."
The lights in the Eon cell blocks came on all at once. Eli Ever opened his eyes, looking up at the cell's mirrored ceiling, and saw himself, as always. Clear skin, brown hair, strong jaw, a copy of the boy he'd been at Lockland. A pre-med student at the top of his class, the peak of promise. As if the ice bath hadn't only stopped his heart, but had frozen time itself. 15 years, and though his face and body remained unchanged, Eli had aged in other ways. His mind had sharpened, hardened. He'd shed some of his more youthful ideals, about himself, about God. But those were the kinds of changes that didn't show in the reflected glass. Eli rose from the cot, stretched, and padded barefoot across the private cell that, for nearly 5 years, had marked the boundaries of his world. He went to the sink and splashed cold water on his face, then crossed to the low shelf that ran against one wall, folders stacked along its length. All of them were beige, ordinary, except for one, a thick black file at the end with a name printed on the front. His name. Eli never reached for that one. Didn't need to. He'd memorized the contents. Instead, his fingers danced along the spines before coming to rest on one considerably thicker than the rest, unmarked, save for a simple black X. One of his few open cases. A pet project of sorts. The Hunter. Eli sat at the table in the center of his cell and flipped back the cover, turned through the pages of the file, skimming past the reports of older killings to the most recent one. The EO's name was Jack Linden, a mechanic 300 miles west of Merritt. He'd slipped through Eon's algorithm, but not, apparently, the Hunter's notice. A crime scene photo showed the EO on his back, amid a sea of tools. He'd been gunned down at point-blank range. Eli ran a finger absently over the injury wound. A pressure seal sounded nearby, and a few seconds later the far wall of Eli's cell turned clear, dissolving from solid white to fiberglass. A thick-set man with salt and pepper hair stood on the other side, carrying another file and, as always, a mug of coffee. The last 15 years might not have touched Eli, but every single one had left its mark on Stell. The man nodded at the beige folder in Eli's hands. Any new theories? Eli let the file fall shut.
No,
he said, setting it aside and rising from his chair.
What can I do for you, Director?
There's a new case,
said Stell, setting the file and mug in the fiberglass cubby.
I want your thoughts.
Eli approached the barrier and collected both offerings.
Marcella Riggins,
he read aloud, returning to his seat and taking a long, slow sip of his drink. Eli didn't need coffee, just as he didn't need to eat or sleep, but some habits were psychological. The steaming mug was a small piece of change in a static world, a concession, a prop, but one that allowed him to pretend, if only for a moment, that he was still human. Eli set the coffee aside and began to turn through the file. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. But it was all they would give him. A stack of paper and Stell's power of observation. And so he flicked through page after page, skimming the evidence, the aftermath, before finally pausing on a photo of human remains, a diamond glinting in the ash. He set the file aside and met Stell's waiting gaze.
All right,
said Eli.
Shall we begin?
Roman numeral 9. 5 years ago. Location uncertain. After Eli killed Victor, it was all a blur. First, the chaos. The red and blue lights, the sirens, the officers storming through the Falcon Price, and the horrible realization they weren't on his side. Then came the cuffs, so tight they cut into Eli's wrists, and the black hood, swallowing the sight of Victor's corpse and the blood-slicked concrete, muffling the voices and the orders and the slammed doors, erasing everything but Eli's own breath, his pounding heart, his desperate words. Burn the body. Burn the body. Burn the body. Then came the cell, more like a concrete box than a room, and Eli slamming his fists against the door over and over until his fingers broke and healed, broke and healed. The only evidence, the blood left smeared across the steel. And then, in the end, there was the lab. Hands forcing Eli down, cold steel on his back and straps cinched so tight they cut into skin, pale, sterile walls, and 2 bright lights, and the chemical smell of disinfectant. In the center of it all, a man in white, his face swimming above Eli's. Dark eyes set deep behind black glasses, hands drawing on plastic gloves.
My name, said the man, is Dr. Haverty.
He selected a scalpel as he spoke.
Welcome to my lab.
Leaned in close.
We are going to understand each other.
And then he began to cut. Dissect. That was the word for it when the subject was dead. Vivisect. That was the word when they were still alive. But when they couldn't die? What was the word for that? Eli's faith had faltered in that room. He had found hell in that room. And the only sign of God was that no matter what Haverty did, Eli continued to survive, whether he wanted to or not. Time unraveled in Haverty's lab. Eli thought he knew pain, but pain for him had become a bright and fleeting thing, an instant's discomfort. In the doctor's hands, it became a solid state.
Your regeneration truly is remarkable, said the doctor, retrieving the scalpel with blood-stained gloves. Shall we find its limit?
You're not blessed, Victor had said. You're a science experiment. Those words came back to Eli now. And so did Victor. Eli saw him in the lab, watched him circle the table at Haverty's back, slip in and out of Eli's line of sight as he studied the doctor's incisions. Maybe you're in hell. You don't believe in hell, thought Eli. The corner of Victor's mouth twitched. But you do. Every night, Eli would collapse onto his cot, shivering and sick from the hours pinned to the steel table. And every morning, it would start again. Eli's power had a single flaw, and 10 years after Victor first discovered it, so did Haverty. Eli's body, for all its regeneration, couldn't reject foreign objects. If they were small enough, he healed around them. If they were large enough, a knife, a saw, a clamp, his body wouldn't heal at all. The first time Dr. Haverty cut out Eli's heart, he thought he might finally die. The doctor held it up for him to see before cutting it free. And for a fraction of a second, Eli's pulse faltered, failed. The equipment screamed. But by the time Haverty set the heart in its sterile tray, there was a new one already beating in Eli's open chest. The doctor breathed a single word.
Extraordinary.
The worst part, thought Eli, was that Dr. Haverty liked to talk. He kept up a casual stream of conversation as he sawed and sliced, drilled and broke. In particular, he was fascinated by Eli's scars, the brutal cross-hatching on Eli's back, the only marks that would never fade. "Tell me about them," he'd say, plunging a needle into Eli's spine. "There are 32, he'd say, drilling into Eli's bones. "I counted," he'd say, cracking open Eli's chest. "You can talk to me, Eli. I'm happy to listen." But Eli couldn't talk, even if he wanted to. It took all his effort not to scream. Roman numeral 10. 25 years ago. The first home. Once upon a time, when the marks on his back were still fresh, Eli told himself that he was growing wings. After all, his mother thought Eli was an angel, even if his father said he had the devil in him. Eli had never done anything to make the pastor think that, but the man claimed he could see the shadow in the boy's eyes, and whenever he caught a glimpse of it, he'd take Eli by the arm and lead him out to the private chapel that sat beside their clapboard house. Eli used to love the little chapel. It had the prettiest picture window, all red and blue and green-stained glass, facing east so it caught the morning light. The floor was made of stone. It was cold beneath Eli's bare feet, even in summer, and there in the center of the room was a metal cross, driven straight down into the foundation. Eli remembered thinking it seemed violent, the way the cross broke and split the floor, as if thrown from a horrible height. The first time his father saw the shadow, he kept one hand on Eli's shoulder as they walked, the other clutching a coiled leather strap. Eli's mother watched them go, twisting a towel in her hands. "John," she said, just once. But Eli's father didn't look back, didn't stop until they'd crossed the narrow lawn and the chapel door had fallen shut behind them. Pastor Cardale told Eli to go to the cross and hold on to the horizontal bar, and at first Eli refused, sobbing, pleading, trying to apologize for whatever he'd done. But it didn't help. His father tied Eli's hands in place and beat him worse for his defiance. Eli had been 9 years old. Later that night, his mother treated the angry lash marks on his back and told him that he had to be strong, that God tested them, and so did Eli's father. Her sleeves inched up as she draped cool strips of cloth over her son's wounded shoulders, and Eli could just see the edges of old scars on the backs of her arms as she told him it would be okay, told him it would get better. And for a little while, it always did. Eli would do everything he could to be good, to be worthy, to avoid his angry father's gaze. But the calm never lasted. Sooner or later, the pastor would glimpse the devil in his son again and lead Eli back to the chapel. Sometimes the beatings were months apart, sometimes days. Sometimes Eli thought he deserved it, needed it even. He would step up to the cross and curl his fingers around the cold metal cross and pray, not to God, not at first, but to his father. He prayed that the pastor would stop seeing whatever he saw while he carved new feathers into the torn wings of Eli's back. Eli learned not to scream, but his eyes would still blur with tears, the colors in the stained glass running together until all he saw was light. He held on to that, as much as to the steel cross beneath his fingers. Eli didn't know how he was broken, but he wanted to be healed. He wanted to be saved. Roman numeral 11. 4 years ago. Eon, laboratory wing. Stell knocked his knuckles on the counter. "I'm here to speak with one of your subjects," he said. "Eli Cardale."
"I'm sorry, sir, he's in testing."
Stell frowned. Again? This was the third time he had come to see Eli, and the third time he'd been fed a line. The first time the excuse had been believable, the second inconvenient. Now it was obviously a lie. He hadn't pulled rank up until this point, but only because he didn't want the headache, or the reputation. Eon was still a new venture, his venture. So new that the building around them wasn't even finished. But it was also his responsibility. And Stell knew in his gut that something was wrong. The unease pinched, like an ulcer.
"That's the same answer I was given last time."
The woman, Stell didn't know if she was a doctor, a scientist, or a secretary, pursed her lips.
"This is a research lab, sir. Testing is a frequent component."
"Then you won't mind interrupting the current session."
The woman's frown deepened.
"With a patient such as Mr. Ever—"
"Cardale," corrected Stell. Ever had been a self-appointed moniker, aggrandizing and arrogant, if slightly prophetic. His real name was Elliot Eli Cardale.
"With a patient such as Mr. Cardale," she amended, "testing requires immense preparation. Ending an exam early would be a waste of Eon resources."
"And this," said Stell, "is a waste of my time."
He pinched the bridge of his nose.
"I'll observe the session until it's finished."
A shadow crossed her face.
"Perhaps if you'd rather wait here—"
With that, Stell's unease turned to dread.
Take me to him. Now.
Roman numeral 12. 23 years ago. The first home. Eli sat on the porch steps and looked up at the sky. It was a beautiful night. The strobe of red and blue lights painting the house, the lawn, the chapel, the ambulance and the coroner's van parked in the grass. One unnecessary, the other waiting. He pressed a worn old Bible to his chest while the cops and medics moved around him as if in orbit, close but never touching.
Kid's in shock, said an officer.
Eli didn't think that was true. He didn't feel shaken. Didn't feel anything but calm. Maybe that was shock. He kept waiting for it to wear off, for the steady hum in his head to give way to terror, to sadness. But it didn't. Can you blame him? Lost his mother a month ago, now this. Lost. That was a strange word. Lost suggested something misplaced, something that might be recovered. He hadn't lost his mother. After all, he'd been the one to find her. Lying in the tub, floating in a white dress, stained pink by the water. Palms up, as if in supplication, her forearms open from elbow to wrist. No, he hadn't lost her. She'd left him. Left Eli alone, trapped in a house with Pastor John Cardale. A female medic brought a hand to Eli's shoulder, and he flinched, half from the surprise of contact, and half from the fact the latest welts were still fresh under his shirt. She said something. He wasn't listening. A few moments later, they wheeled out the body. The medic tried to block Eli's view, but there was nothing to see. Only a black body bag. Death made clean. Neat. Sterile. Eli closed his eyes and drew up the image of his father lying broken at the bottom of the stairs. A shallow red pool, spreading around the pastor's head like a halo. Only in the dim basement the blood had looked black. His eyes wet. His mouth hinging open and closed. What had his father been going down there to do? Eli would never know. He opened his eyes and began to absently thumb the pages of the book.
"How old are you?"
asked the medic. Eli swallowed.
12. Do you know your next of kin?
He shook his head. There was an aunt somewhere, a cousin maybe, but Eli had never met them. His world had been here. His father's church. Their congregation. There was a phone tree, he thought, a communication network used to spread the word when there was a celebration, a birth, or a death. The woman slipped away from his side and spoke to two of the officers. Her voice was low, but Eli caught some of the words.
The boy has nothing.
But again, she was wrong. Eli didn't have a mother, or a father, or a home. But he still had faith. Not because of the scars on his back, or any of Pastor Cardale's less physical sermons. No. Eli had faith because of how it felt when he pushed his father down the basement stairs, when the pastor's head struck the basement floor at the bottom, when he finally stopped moving. In that moment, Eli had felt peace, like a small sliver of the world made right. Something, someone, had guided Eli's hand, given him the courage to place his palm flat against his father's back, and push. The pastor had fallen so fast, bounced like a ball down the old wooden steps before landing in a heap at the bottom. Eli had followed slowly, taking each step with care as he drew his phone from his pocket. But he didn't dial, didn't push call. Instead, Eli sat down on the bottom step, safely away from the blood, and held the phone in his hands and waited. Waited until his father's chest stilled, until the pool of blood stopped spreading, and the pastor's eyes went empty, flat. Eli remembered one of his father's sermons then. Those who don't believe in the soul have never seen one leave. He was right, thought Eli. Finally, dialing 911. There really was a difference.
Don't worry,
said the medic, returning to the front porch.
We're going to find somewhere for you to go.
She knelt down in front of him, a gesture clearly meant to make him feel like they were equals.
I know it's scary,
she said, even though it wasn't.
But I'm going to tell you something that helps me when I'm feeling overwhelmed. Every end is a new beginning.
She straightened.
Come on, let's go.
Eli rose to his feet and followed her down the porch steps. He was still waiting for the sense of calm to fade, but it didn't. Not when they led him away from the house. Not when they perched him on the edge of the unused ambulance. Not when they drove him away. Eli looked back once, and only once, at the house, the chapel, and then he turned, facing forward. Every end is a new beginning. Roman numeral 13. 4 years ago. Eon. Laboratory wing. Stell entered the observation room just in time to see a man in a white lab coat crack open Cardale's chest. The patient was strapped to a steel table, and the surgeon was using some kind of saw, and a collection of clamps and metal pins, and Eli was not only still alive, he was awake. A mask ran across the EO's nose and mouth, with a hose connected to a machine behind his head, but whatever it was feeding Eli, it didn't seem to be helping. The pain showed in every muscle. His whole body tensed against the restraints, the skin around his wrists and ankles white from pressure. The strap held Eli's head back against the steel table, denying him a view of his own dissection, though Stell doubted he needed to look to know what was happening. Beads of sweat ran down Eli's face and into his hair as the surgeon widened the cut in his chest. Stell didn't know what he'd expected to find, but he hadn't expected this. As the surgeon finished sawing through the patient's sternum and pinned the flesh back, Cardale groaned, the sound low and muffled by the mask. Blood poured out of his open chest, slicking the metal table, the lip of which was too shallow to contain the ceaseless flow. Ribbons of red spilled over the sides, dripping to the floor. Stell felt sick.
Remarkable, isn't he?
He turned to find an average-looking man tugging off a pair of blood-slicked gloves. Behind round glasses, the doctor's deep-set eyes were bright, pupils dilated with the pleasure of discovery.
"What the hell do you think you're doing?" demanded Stell.
"Learning," said the doctor.
"You're torturing him."
"We're studying him."
"Well, he's conscious."
"Necessarily," said the doctor with a patient smile. "Mr. Cardale's regenerative abilities render any anesthesia useless."
"And what's with the mask?"
"Ah," said the doctor. "One of my more genius moments, that. You see, we cannot anesthetize him, but that doesn't mean we can't dampen his functions a little. The mask is part of an oxygen deprivation system. It reduces the breathable air to 25%. It's taking all of his regenerative ability to stave off the damage done by starving the cells, which buys us a bit more time on the rest of the body before it heals." Stell stared at Eli's chest as it struggled to rise and fall. From this angle, Stell could almost see his heart. "We've never come across an EO like Mr. Cardale," continued the doctor. "His ability, if we find a way to harness it, could revolutionize medicine."
"EO abilities can't be harnessed," said Stell. "They aren't transferable."
"Yet," said the doctor. "But if we could understand—"
"Enough,"
said Stell, transfixed by the sight of Eli's ruined body.
"Tell them to stop."
The doctor frowned. "If they take out the clamps, he'll heal and we'll have to start all over again. I really must insist."
"What's your name?"
"Haverty."
"Well, Dr. Haverty, I'm Director Stell, and I'm officially discontinuing this experiment. Make them stop, or lose your job."
The sick smile slid from Haverty's face. He pulled a microphone from the viewing room wall and clicked it on. "Terminate the session," he ordered the surgeon still in the room. The men and women hesitated. "I said, terminate it," repeated Haverty curtly. The surgeons began to methodically remove the various pins and clamps from Eli's open chest cavity. The moment they were gone, the tension in the EO's body began to recede. His back sank to the metal table, and his hands unclenched, the color returning to his limbs as his body put itself back together. Ribs cracked into place, skin settled and fused. The lines of his face smoothed, and his breathing, while still labored, they left the mask on, began to even. The only sign that something horrific had happened was the sheer quantity of blood left pooling on the table and floor. "Are you happy now?" grumbled Dr. Haverty.
"I'm a long way from happy,"
said Stell, storming out of the observation room.
"And you, Dr. Haverty, you're fired."
"Put your forehead against the wall and your hands through the gap." Eli did as he was told, feeling for the break in the fiberglass. He couldn't see anything. His world had been a mottled black wall since the soldiers had thrown the hood over his head and dragged him from the concrete cell that morning. He knew before they came that something was wrong. No, not wrong, but certainly different. Haverty was a man of habit, and even though Eli didn't have a perfect sense of time, he had a tenuous enough hold to know their last session had ended too abruptly. He found the gap in the fiberglass, a kind of narrow shelf, and rested his wrists on the lip. A hand jerked his hands farther into the gap, but a few moments later the cuffs came free. "Take 3 steps back." Eli retreated, expecting to meet another wall, but finding only space. "Reach up and remove the hood." Eli did, assaulted by the sudden brightness of the space. But unlike the sterile overheads of the operating theater, the light here was crisp and clean, without being glaring. He was facing a floor-to-ceiling fiberglass wall, perforated by holes and interrupted only by the narrow cubby through which he'd placed his hands. On the other side stood 3 soldiers in head-to-toe riot gear, their faces hidden behind helmets. 2 gripped batons, cattle prods judging by the faint hum, the slight current of blue light. The 3rd was coiling the discarded cuffs. "What am I doing here?" asked Eli. But the soldiers didn't answer. They simply turned and left, steps echoing as they retreated. Somewhere a door opened, closed, pressurized, and as it did, the world beyond the fiberglass disappeared, the wall, transparent seconds before, becoming opaque. Eli turned, taking in his new surroundings. The cell was little more than a large cube, but after the months he'd spent strapped to various surfaces, sealed in a cell no bigger than a tomb, Eli was still grateful for the chance to move. He traced the perimeter of the cell, counted off the steps, took note of the features and their absences. He noted 4 cameras set flush into the ceiling. There were no windows, no obvious door. He'd heard the fiberglass barrier retract into the floor, rise again behind him. Only a cot, a table with 1 chair, 1 corner fitted with a toilet, sink, and shower. A wardrobe consisting solely of gray cotton lay folded on a floating shelf. Victor's ghost ran a hand over the folded clothes. And so the angel trades hell for purgatory, mused the phantom. Eli didn't know what this place was, only knew that he wasn't being strapped down, wasn't being cut open. And that was an improvement. He peeled off his clothes and stepped into the shower, luxuriated in the freedom of turning the water on and off, washed away the sense of rubbing alcohol and blood and disinfectant, expecting to see the water at his feet run thick with the grime of a year's torture. But Haverty had always been meticulous. They'd hosed Eli down every morning and every night, so the only traces left behind were the scars that didn't show. Eli lowered himself onto the cot, pressed his back into the wall, and waited. Roman numeral 14. 23 years ago. The second home. The phone tree worked. Eli arrived at the Russo's house that night with a backpack full of clothes and the knowledge that his stay was temporary. A place for him to wait while the authorities tracked down a living relative, one willing to collect him. Mrs. Russo met him at the door in a robe. It was late, and the Russo kids, there were 5 of them, ranging in age from 6 to 15, were already asleep. She took Eli's bag and led him inside. The house was warm and soft in a lived-in way, the surfaces scuffed, the edges worn smooth. "Poor thing," she clucked under her breath as she led Eli into the kitchen. She gestured at the table for him to sit and continued to murmur, more to herself than to him. The sound she made was so different from his own mother, whose whispered words had always been tinged with a hint of desperation. My angel, you must be good, you must be light." Eli lowered himself into a rickety kitchen chair and stared down at his hands, still waiting for the shock to come, or go, whichever it was meant to. Mrs. Russo placed a steaming mug in front of him, and he curled his fingers around it. It was hot, uncomfortably so, but he didn't pull away. The pain was familiar, almost welcome. What now? Thought Eli. Every end is a new beginning. Mrs. Russo sat down across from him. She reached her hands out and wrapped them over his. Eli flinched back at the touch, tried to pull away, but her grip was firm. "You must be hurting," she said. And he was. His hands were burning from the mug, but he knew she meant a deeper, heavier pain, and that he didn't feel. If anything, Eli felt lighter than he had in years. "God never gives us more than we can bear," she continued. Eli focused on the small gold cross that hung around her neck. "But it's up to us to find the purpose in the pain." The purpose in the pain. "Come on," she said, patting his hand. "I'll make up the couch." Eli had never been a good sleeper. He'd spent half of every night listening to his father move just beyond the door, like a wolf in the woods behind the house, a predator circling too near. But the Russo's place was quiet, calm, and Eli lay awake, marveling at the way 8 bodies under one roof could take up less space than 2. The quiet didn't last. At some point, Eli must have drifted off because he started awake to raucous laughter.